Got quiet. Thank you all for coming. My name is Skip Rutherford. I'm Dean of the Clinton School, and welcome to another in a great series of programs done by Nikolai DePippa. I say this often, he runs the best college speaker series in the country. And you're in for a real treat tonight, let me assure you. Could I please ask if you would turn your cell phones and other electronic devices off unless you're tweeting away, which of course you can. Clinton School student Salil Joshi will be introducing our speaker. Salil lives in Little Rock, earned his bachelor's degree from Emory, earned a master's in medical science from Mississippi College, pursuing a concurrent master's in public health with the Faye Bozeman School at UAMS, in addition to his Clinton School Master of Public Service degree. He is president and founder of TEDx Markham Street, and many of you are familiar with the TED lectures, and Salil's done a great job here in Arkansas with those. He's working with the Arkansas Food Bank on issues relating to hunger regarding seniors, particularly those without any services. And this summer, for his international project, he's headed for a great adventure. I hope I can get this right. I've told him that if I didn't, do not correct me, please, but he is going to the Netherlands to study what is happening in the European Union regarding the clinical trials of medical marijuana and the impact it has on the doctors, the hospitals, and the pharmaceutical growers. What an interesting assignment where medical marijuana is legal in the European Union. So, what a fantastic international project. Please welcome Salil Joshi.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce Mr. Nick Schifrin. Mr. Schifrin is an accomplished producer and foreign correspondent, a graduate from Columbia University, focusing in history, U.S. history, and has reported on more than 30 countries while working with ABC, Al Jazeera, America, NPR, and PBS. From 2002, Mr. Schifrin was the producer for ABC News and reported on the Carrie Edwards and Arnold Schwarzenegger campaigns, the United Nations, Hurricanes Katrina and Wilma, and launched the World News Webcast, the first network program designed specifically as a webcast and as a podcast. Mr. Schifrin has also covered every major story in South and Southwest Asia as a correspondent for India, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. As an ABC India correspondent, Mr. Schifrin interviewed the Dalai Lama during the 2008 uprising in Tibet and was one of the first foreign correspondents to cover the Mumbai terrorist attacks. Schifrin has also been one of the first journalists to arrive in Abbottabad, Pakistan after Osama bin Laden's death, and delivered one of the year's biggest exclusives, the first video inside Osama bin Laden's compound. 2 years later, in 2013, Mr. Schifrin became Al Jazeera America's first foreign correspondent reporting on the 2014 war in Gaza, the Syrian war from Syria's Turkey, Lebanese, and Jordanian borders, and in the conflict and annexation of Crimea in Ukraine. Currently, a special correspondent at PBS, Mr. Schifrin creates week-long, in-depth series for flagship evening news show NewsHour. A notable series created by Mr. Schifrin is called Nigeria, Pain and Promise, which covered the country's corruption, economy, anti-gay laws, and fight against Boko Haram. He also has covered Egypt and Kenya. Mr. Schifrin reporting has earned numerous awards in the field of journalism, and he has won the Emmy for his business and financial reporting in 2008, the National Edward R. Murrow Award for his coverage on Osama bin Laden in 2012, and the David Kaplan Award for his coverage in the Gaza war by Overseas Press Club in 2013. Mr. Schifrin's talk tonight is titled, Understanding and Empathy Over Narrow-Mindedness and Fear. Please join me in giving Mr. Schifrin a warm welcome to the Clinton School Public Service.
Good evening, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Skip, wherever you went. Thank you, Salil. Told you to take out all the adjectives. You didn't listen. I want to talk today about empathy and understanding, as Salil just said, the kind of compassion and knowledge that replaces narrow-mindedness and fear. For as long as I can remember, I have been led by those two principles, empathy and understanding. My parents, my teachers, urged me to judge people not by the categories they belong to, but by the breadth and dimension of their characters. I've tried to make that a cornerstone of my journalism, and I urge you, for those of you students and for everybody in the room, to use those principles as a prism through which you can approach public service. And to explain what in the world I'm talking about, let me begin with a story. As Salil mentioned, I've covered about half dozen wars, and the bloodiest, most difficult personally to cover was the war in Gaza in the summer of 2014. And don't worry, this is not about politics, this is about people, and I guess that's really my point. I was Al Jazeera America's Middle East correspondent at the time, and I spent about 5 weeks in Gaza, more time than almost any other foreign correspondent did. And when I left Gaza, early August 2014, I went to a shop in West Jerusalem, it was owned by Jewish owners, to fix my watch. And the owners were talkative and said, "Oh, so what do you do?" And I knew where this was going to go. I mean, working for Al Jazeera in Israel is about as popular as clubbing dead seals for a living. So I said, well, I'm a journalist, and I left it at that. So that's very interesting. Oh, well, what kind of journalist? What do you do? And I said, I cover stuff. I said, oh, come on, stuff? What do you cover? Were you in Gaza? And I said, yes, I've been in Gaza. I've just come out, actually. And they became very excited and said, oh, well, tell us the truth. Tell us the truth. What is really happening in Gaza? I started talking, and I got through about 6 words before they interrupted me. They yelled at me, all you reporters are the same. You all hate Israel. You don't all tell the truth. Did you tell the truth that Palestinian mothers were throwing their babies in front of our bombs? That's what they thought. That's what they honestly believed, and frankly, what a lot of the media had told them, that Palestinian mothers were throwing their children in front of GPS-guided missiles. For the record, they weren't. Now, this lack of empathy goes both ways. In Gaza, you see a lot of kids. It is one of the most densest places on the planet with one of the highest birth rates on the planet. And that means that children are everywhere. And during the war, I had a particular conversation that I won't forget anytime soon. The conversation was with a 9-year-old boy. And in Gaza, if you're 9 years old, you have survived 3 wars already. I asked him what he thought of Israel. He said, well, I've never met an Israeli who isn't a soldier. I believe Israel should be wiped off the planet, and I think all Israelis should be killed. It's a 9-year-old, and he looks up to his father, and his father nods approval. That's what the 9-year-old believed, and that's what he was clearly taught. And it occurred to me in those weeks in Gaza and in Israel afterward that the opposite of war isn't peace, it's humanity. It's understanding that people on the other side of a wall or a border love their children as much as you do. It's understanding that people on the other side of a conflict or on the other side of the world share similar goals of education, living in peace, and improving the next generation's quality of life. And in my journalism, I would consider myself successful if I had reached one mother or one father sitting on their couch somewhere in America watching a story I'd done on television, turning to each other after the piece and says, I get it now. I understand a little bit more about that Pakistani mother or Palestinian father or Ukrainian daughter because we feel a little bit the same way. We share something. And now, hopefully, they say I'm a little bit better informed about the world. For more than a century, journalism has considered compassion a dirty word. That compassion somehow forfeits objectivity. But I believe the opposite. Empathy creates a desire to understand someone, not necessarily agree with that person. Empathy compels fair treatment of everyone, good people, bad people, villains, perpetrators. And that increases, my empathy that is, increases my audience's understanding. When we're empathetic, we become more connected to our environment and to the people we speak to. And I'm a good journalist, I believe, when I can empathize, when I can truly grasp with the person I'm interviewing. It's not to say that I'm overly sympathetic. I would never ignore a story because it hurts someone, but I will try and connect with my subject, try and share his or her story with my viewer in a personal way so that the viewer can really understand someone who may live on the opposite side of the planet from them. Now, you may be sitting here saying this is obvious. Obviously, we share a common humanity. But let me assure you, in journalism, in diplomacy, in public service, it is not obvious to many people. It is not obvious to television producers or newspaper editors in America who often resort to stereotypes and don't believe their viewers care about those people halfway across the world, especially when those people are considered an other, considered an enemy, or can easily be dismissed as such. It's not obvious, frankly, to many diplomats in Washington who often exist in a foreign policy box whose sides were erected decades ago. And it is certainly not obvious to today's politicians. The country's political climate, frankly, the complexity of the world right now, seem to be breeding fear, breeding the encouragement of otherness, the encouragement of judgment in which religion or a group or ethnicity are cast as the problem without regard to common humanity. Compassion and knowledge that replaces narrow-mindedness and fear. And here, I would argue, is where journalists and students of public service share a goal. We write stories or cables or analyses or policy that not only convey but also transfer nuance and understanding and perspective. And our audience, whether that couple on the couch or whether the head of an international NGO or whether a diplomat in Washington, will base decisions on our writing. They'll make policy based on what we write. We must work to replace misunderstandings born by ignorance with empathy born by exposure. Because if we don't provide that understanding and empathy to our mutual audiences, it's not only bad storytelling or bad journalism, it also creates bad foreign policy. Because if we don't understand, we don't make the right decisions. If we lack understanding, if we don't see the world through empathy, we will choose the wrong allies. We mistakenly elevate short-term security goals, and we lose a chance to do long-term good. And this is the fun part. Let me take you through a few examples, a few war stories to demonstrate this. I was the ABC News correspondent in Kabul and Islamabad for 4 years. And in 2009, I drove through Kandahar with Captain Michael Thurman. Thurman was an example of someone I've met often, a post-9/11 officer who came of age in a military fighting 2 wars at once. He was out of Fort Stewart, he was smart, he was brave, and frankly, it seemed like he had read every book on the insurgency in Afghanistan. Now, we're in late 2009, we're in Kandahar. This is just the beginning of a U.S. surge, and Kandahar is the focus. And to paint the picture a little bit, Kandahar's a city where many of the roads have recently been made asphalt, but it still smells of diesel because everybody uses generators. The shops, the boundary walls around homes are all mud. Men with beards and turbans fill the markets. Women, if they are allowed out, are wearing burqas. So on this day, Thurman's orders are to speed through the city quickly. But to his credit, on his way out of town, we're in a convoy of MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush patrol vehicles. These are about 35,000 pounds each. He sees something across the street and he says, stop. So the whole convoy stops. And what he sees across the street is an empty fuel truck on its side and a passenger van next to it, and a group of people who were surrounding the drivers who were badly injured. So Thurman and his medic hopped out of their vehicles and walked across the street for 30 minutes. They helped. The medic examined huge cuts on one of the driver's head. There's a bleeding gash on the van's driver. Thurman handed out water, played with the kids who were kind of nipping at his feet, and talked, or tried to talk, with the elders. In response, they ignored him. He took off his helmet and his glasses. He wasn't supposed to do that, and they still ignored him. 30 minutes pass, everybody's patched up. he starts to leave, and nobody says thank you. Nobody shakes his hand. In Afghanistan, guests are royalty. Not shaking Captain Thurman's hand that day was the equivalent of slapping him in the face. And I asked him, "Captain, what happened? Why were you snubbed?" He said, quote, "They still don't like us. When I took my helmet off, a kid jumped away from me. They're not used to seeing me as a person. We haven't spent enough time engaging them." For years, American soldiers who were deployed to Kandahar were suspicious. Rightly so. They were getting bombed a lot. But they often failed the time to connect with the people. Not only did they not approach the people with empathy, often, and some soldiers admitted this, it wasn't clear if they wanted to understand the people who were around them. Because the Afghans that we did spend time with back then, and we did help install into government positions, were often ruthless warlords who were thrown out by the Taliban, the very people whom Kandaharis trusted least. And one other story about this. One of those warlords I met at Christmas in 2009. His name was Abdul Razik. He welcomed me into his office with a very squeaky voice. "Oh, you're welcome anytime. The embassy has given us a lot of money." And then he gives me a big hug. His boyishness hid a ruthless history. For years, Western officials admitted, only on background of course, that they knew he helped run drug rings, private militias, smuggling rackets, his own prison. They knew he helped fuel the insurgency with his opium connections, and they knew he committed horrific human rights abuses, including torture. But despite that history, the U.S. allied with him because he provided immediate short-term security gains. He controlled a vital crossing between Afghanistan and Pakistan. He did his job well. Kandahar was very violent. His little town, Spin Boldak, was an island of calm. The U.S. decided he was doing too good a job and needed him too much to object to his abuses. He would later become the police chief of Kandahar City and then the police chief of Kandahar Province. We helped him. We helped put him there. We elevated short-term security gains over any understanding or compassion for the majority of Kandaharis who, frankly, despised him. You may say, okay, Afghanistan's a tough place. He brought security. Job well done. Fair enough. But the problem is he didn't bring security. In response to his ruthlessness, 5 years later, we now know that hundreds of Afghans joined the Taliban. Security decreased as Afghans fought their own government because their government was represented by people like him. And today, since most of the U.S. troops have left, security in Kandahar is not good. This did not create stability. We jeopardize Kandahar's long-term prospects, I would argue, because we refuse to see Kandaharis through the lens of understanding and empathy. If we had, we never would have chosen someone like that to ally ourselves with. Quick story about Pakistan. In early November 2009, Secretary of State Clinton started a press conference in Islamabad at the exact same time a bomb ripped through a market in Peshawar, about a 2-hour drive away. The market was called Meena Bazaar. It was rare because it catered for families. But after the blast, there were no girls choosing colorful bangles, no women buying dresses. The small, fragile shops were piles of debris now. Explosion was one of the most violent acts of terrorism in Pakistan's history. Official death count was 110, unofficially it was probably 200. The Pakistani Taliban were in the middle of one of the most violent campaigns of retribution in the country's history. They were blowing up not only police and soldiers, but also mosques and markets full of civilians. And yet, the depravity of a bomb clearly designed to kill as many innocents as possible did not stoke the anger of the people at the Taliban. Most people in Peshawar who I talked to blame the U.S. Clinton that day spoke about developing a, quote, partnership between the people of U.S. and Pakistan. Her speech fell on deaf ears. Residents either directly accused the U.S. of planting the bomb, as outrageous as that is, or accused it, more accurately, of inspiring the violence by pushing Pakistan to fight America's war in Afghanistan. Now, many U.S. diplomats called that criticism unfair or a conspiracy theory, perhaps both true. But the people of Peshawar were reacting to a basic fact. Their lives had gotten worse since the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. Before 9/11, there was one suicide attack in Pakistan. Since, About 1,000. The people of Peshawar were responding to the world around them and what they saw the U.S. doing. And what did they see? They saw drone strikes in the nearby tribal areas. They saw the U.S. pouring money into developing Pakistan, but much of it going to high-priced Western consultants who did not engage with the population. And they saw the U.S. pouring money into a Pakistani military that supported Afghan militants that were the good Taliban, even though clearly the blowback was obvious. Again, a lack of understanding. And because, as one diplomat put it, Langley, the CIA controlled policy, not the State Department, foggy bottom, the emphasis was on short-term counterterrorism gains rather than on the long-term humanitarian programs that many Pakistanis argue they needed and that emerged from a policy driven by more understanding and empathy. One more story. Wajir, Kenya. This is 70 miles from the Somali border. It looks like the Wild West 130 years ago today. The roads are all dirt, the shops are one story, made of mud, donkey carts fill the town. I was there about 2 months ago. Now, northeastern Kenya has a problem with al-Shabaab. It's a militant group based next door in Somalia. This town, Wajir, has been attacked by al-Shabaab, and a local town nearby was even taken over briefly by al-Shabaab. So the police are armed like soldiers, and the soldiers are very aggressive. We can understand that. Perhaps too aggressive. Wajir is full of Muslim Kenyans who are of Somali descent, who say they've been abused or tortured by those same police and soldiers. And when you ask these people, what do you think of the U.S.? They will say, accurately, the U.S. is training and funding the Kenyan military and supporting the Kenyan government who's corrupt. They associate us with the worst of Kenyan actions. And what happens to many of these people? They join al-Shabaab and they fight their own government. Now, behind the scenes, U.S. officials insist they're trying to fight this. They object to human rights abuses. President Obama himself raised corruption in Kenya. He admonished Kenyan officials in Nairobi for being corrupt. But it is still the case, the U.S. is supporting the Kenyan military and Kenyan government, and that means that al-Shabaab can not only recruit abused Kenyan Muslims, but turn them against Kenya and the United States. The more empathy that the Kenyan and U.S. governments had for the people of northeast Kenya, the less likely they will join al-Shabaab, the more likely they will feel that their government cares for them, and therefore fight al-Shabaab. Now, none of this is easy, and I could tell an anecdote about Syria, but that's really, really complex. And I admit that I am presenting this notion that's slightly simplistic. But I will argue that as journalists and diplomats and students of public service, our job is to get out on the so-called front lines and find out what's happening, talk to people, understand their perspective, present their stories to our respective audiences in a way so those audiences can understand, can connect, can feel empathy. Because if you don't understand the people you're writing about, we won't make the right decisions. We won't have the right policy. And as a country, if that happens, we will understand less, become more narrow-minded and more fearful. Understanding and empathy to replace narrow-mindedness and fear. We all watch the news. I would argue that these days creating empathy and understanding has never been more important. Helping create a better informed public and better informed policy will build a more respectful, and this is key, build a more peaceful tomorrow. And hopefully that work will begin today. Thank you very much.
You're not done yet, yeah. Thanks so much, Nick. We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Austin, yeah.
Hey, my name is Austin. I'm a second-year student here at the Clinton School, and I'm curious about the interactions between journalists, the State Department, and the military. Can you touch on kind of what holes you have to jump through to get in different spots, and who you have to communicate with in order to run a story and publish the story and things like that?
Well, there are front doors, side doors, and back doors. And the military, the State Department...
The back door is the most interesting one.
Okay, I'll tell a few anecdotes for the back door. The front door is official, right? Everybody has a press officer. Everybody has someone who is assigned to talk to the media. And that person knows that he or she controls the access, usually. So it is important for journalists to have good relationships with press officers in the State Department, PAOs they're called, in the military, people who deal with the media. And there's different levels of that. I believe in Afghanistan, before the drawdown, the person who was the head of military engagement was a 1-star or 2-star. So the military takes this very seriously. And there is an undersecretary of state who is the equivalent of, I believe, a 3 or 4-star, who also does that. So there is a lot of money and work from the government side on people who deal with the press. Now, of course, we all have sources. And that is the art of journalism, finding people, convincing them to talk. I will say this, that I have never come across or been leaked something that didn't benefit the leaker. So everybody's got an agenda. But sometimes you get lucky. We were telling this story before. I was in Pakistan in 2011 and ended up getting the first video out of bin Laden's compound. And that story came about because a Pakistani official whom I had in, as they call it, drawing room, in my living room for years, happened to be driving down the street as I was driving into the city where bin Laden was killed. And we stopped each other, and there was a negotiation where he helped us film inside the compound. And the fact that he had sat on my couch for years, the fact, frankly, that he had drank a lot of my whiskey. Let's just say that would not have happened had that relationship not been nurtured. And I would argue that as a foreign correspondent who's lived overseas, you have to be careful because we all want friends and need friends, and we all find people who we are friendly with, and some of those people end up being sources. And so it is important as I move to a place to kind of set boundaries with certain people about what they are and are not willing to talk about, because hopefully my friends, and I would call many diplomats my friends, know that they will not be quoted if we're having a beer, and that's important as well. Yeah.
Thank you for coming. I wanted to ask a non-journalistic question. From your experience in Nigeria with Boko Haram and the government there, what do you see for such places as Libya where the states have failed? Do you see any hope there, or what do you see as the future for
There's
those
always
places?
hope. There's absolutely always hope, no matter where. But it takes a lot of good policy, and it takes patience. So I would argue that Nigeria is very different than Libya. Boko Haram was created essentially as an anti-corruption group. Yes, it was Muslim, and yes, the preacher did use radical Islam, but only as a secondary argument. This was a group that was angry at the police for taking so much of their money, and that's why he was popular. It metastasized in large part because the Nigerian military failed to understand it and failed to properly go after it, and that's where corruption comes in. In Libya, I haven't been there in years. I was there right before what year was that, 2011, 2012, right before the no-fly zone was started. So in the days right before Colonel Gaddafi was threatening to deliver a massacre to eastern Libya, the U.S., the Security Council intervened. And then we've got what's happened. I think the people who were involved with the Libya decisions, including, of course, Secretary of State Clinton, would argue today that the mistake was a common one in the U.S. We saw this in Afghanistan after the Soviets withdrew. The U.S. has spent a lot of money and a lot of time with a military effort, with a very pointed diplomatic effort to either change regimes, to save lots of people in eastern Libya's case, and the follow-up kind of lacks, yeah. And so that's what's happened, that they chose the wrong people, I think they would agree, because those were the people who spoke the best English, who the diplomats connected with the most, without really understanding what was going on. So, yes, if you do develop that understanding, I would argue that, yes, there is hope for Libya, but it's going to take a long time. And you know, U.S. administrations don't have a long time. And there is a difficulty in getting state, the Pentagon, the intelligence services, and the White House to agree on a plan, well, especially now, when there'll be a new president in less than a year. So there is a way, and there are ways to try and pull Libya back from a totally failed state. But largely what we are seeing right now in the last days of the administration is, again, a kind of counter-terror effort that is led from the air, drones, special forces, and a very difficult political problem is not really being solved right now.
Yes, sir.
Hello. I'd like you to apply your understanding and empathy to a different arena by giving a letter grade on both those qualities to the 5 current candidates for president. Please, forgetting for a moment that you're at the Clinton School.
Forgetting for a moment that I'm a journalist. I'm not going to go there. But all I'll say is that, you know, I do hope that the candidates and the electorate take foreign affairs seriously. And I do hope that you know, journalists are able to ask pointed questions to the candidates, which I think they have to a certain extent in debates, but clearly there are some gaps here. And I hope that we as a country understand how important it is that these candidates and the next president understand the world and its complexities. It's not simple stuff because, you know, just what we were talking about. It is a very complex, very difficult world right now. And it's important that that world is understood rather than feared.
Yes, sir.
Ron, you would ask a question like that. I have a question about your time at Al Jazeera. Several years ago, I ran into a young woman by the name of Gaia Chekakayan, who is the reporter for RT News, Russia Today. She was in Arkansas trying to make America look bad in regards to the oil spill in Mayflower. And to her, after a conversation, it was obvious that not only were the lines between editorializing and the news blurred, there were no lines. And I wonder if you ran into anything like that at Al Jazeera.
You see me smiling here. I'm not going to reveal everything that happened at Al Jazeera. I left last summer. And again, I think that a lot of people at Al Jazeera and everywhere would argue that Al Jazeera puts a lot of money and effort into covering places that aren't covered. And what happens in the Middle East or the U.S., a lot of people do object to. But Al Jazeera does spend a lot of time and money in South America and South Asia and East Asia, and that is something that's important. And I think that filled a vacuum that still exists because not a lot of other organizations are doing that. Look, I'll just say this, that the more voices that are out there, the better, I think. And as a viewer, talk about understanding, I think it's important that the viewer understands what they're watching and understands, you know, the source of Al Jazeera's news. And if they want to see it through that certain lens, you know, that viewer can. You know, and it's not a terrible idea to know who owns CNN and ABC and that kind of thing, so it's important. But yeah, I'd rather not go into some of the details there.
Right over here.
Hi, thanks for coming. I'm a journalism teacher at a high school about 20 miles south of here at Bryant, and it can be discouraging in the current journalistic climate in America to convince students that it is a worthwhile profession. I wondered if you could maybe say a few words that I could share with my students about why it's so important to become a journalist in America in 2016.
Yeah, I'm not sure a rousing speech about compassion about Afghans will do it.
Well, what you said is so relevant and important, but I guess in addition to that.
No, I think it is important, and I think it is important because, like I said, journalism is often considered compassion a dirty word, and this notion of, the robot, not choosing any sides is dead. It's been dead for years. Let's embrace it. Let's embrace this notion of collective humanity, and again, compassion and empathy doesn't mean you choose sides. It just means you treat people fairly, and I think that's really key. Personally, I would tell them they got to see a lot of cool stuff. I mean, really, on a personal level, it has been the greatest education of my life to be able to go to, whatever it is, 30 some odd countries, meet different people. I mean, these are people I'd never otherwise meet. Some of them my mother probably wishes I hadn't met. Going to places that I would never otherwise go. And I understand that I've had a rare ability to do that because not a lot of people are foreign correspondents or frankly want to be foreign correspondents these days. But it's... there is, and I forget who said this, it was a couple years ago, but he said, and he used the word empathy, he said, journalism has given me the greatest gift, which is worldwide empathy. I sit down with someone and I have fun. This is kind of what he was saying. Ira Glass put it this way, he does a podcast called This American Life, and he said, every time I talk to someone and get them to tell their story, get them to cry or cry with them, I fall in love a little bit. You're not going to fall in love with the Al-Shabaab militant, obviously, but you are going, at least I do, take pride in getting to the point where you get beyond a headline, you get beyond a little propaganda, and you understand them a little bit more so you can convey that understanding to your audience. That is a radical act of empathy, to try and care about a member of Al-Shabaab who, when the interview ended, said, if you don't keep me anonymous, I will kill you. I mean, he just said that very, it's not the first person who said that, sadly. Not the first, yeah, anyway. So that radical act of empathy is something that I can't think of a single profession that would ever give you that opportunity. So yeah, try that. Mm-hmm.
Hello, thank you for coming. My name is Jasmine Peterson. This is actually my advisor. I'm one of the co-editors of the newspaper at our high school, The Perspective. And we as a paper get accused of being a more liberal paper in a more conservative-minded environment. So we try to report stuff like this in a way that is not as biased, but with an empathetic kind of manner. So how would you, or do you have any advice on how to reach our more conservative-minded students who are raised in that mindset, but still teach them empathy and to see that these are still people?
I don't think it has anything to do with being liberal or conservative as a reader, but I'll put it to you this way, which is one teacher once put it this way. There are no homeless people. There are people without homes. I mean, that's kind of a silly statement, but when you think about it, actually, no, it's kind of interesting, right? That there is a person who lives in a field because he was a soldier and this happened and this happened and this happened and this is why and maybe this is how to fix him or whatever, rather than there's a homeless dude down the street, right? The notion of finding humanity in people is not conservative or liberal at all. And frankly, I would argue that any newspaper or television network, the more they approach the levels of humanity that frankly are probably inside of all of us, the more their readers not only will learn, but actually keep coming back. Because, if you watch, for example, a 60-second explainer on something that just blew up, and the good-looking guy and the flak jacket and the perfectly lit hair or whatever is saying something and it's done. And you're not going to remember that the next day, or frankly the next 5 minutes. But if the next day you read something or you watch something about one of the victims and how it was a 16-year-old who wanted to be a doctor who was taking this route to school and all, this takes a lot of work. Right? It takes translators and camera people and producers and correspondents and satellites and it's not easy or expensive. But if you do that, the viewers or the readers or the listeners will say, that I actually learned something. I actually give a, right? I actually care. And I would argue that they will come back for that. So I don't think this is nonpartisan. This is truly about humanity. And I think the more we can deliver that, I think the more it benefits the readers and viewers and listeners, and the more interested they will be.
Over here.
My name is Cameron Iqbal, and I teach at ULR. I had several questions, but I'll ask one.
You can ask
And
multiple, it's all right. I usually ask multiple to people I'm asking questions to. So.
It's about the drone strikes in Pakistan.
Gotcha.
I come from Pakistan, and the 200 or so drone strikes in Pakistan. I mean, while they killed their designated targets, they also killed a large number of civilians, perhaps several thousand. So the question is that, I mean, from an impartial perspective, did the drone strikes make America safer?
I'll get to the answer, I promise, but I'm going to say it's complex because also the narrative. This is fascinating, I think. So the first or second drone strike that the U.S. launched in the tribal areas accidentally hit a school of children. 50 kids died. It was the first or second one. Someone had fed the CIA bad intelligence. So they hit the school. The Pakistani military pretended it was them. That was the kind of relationship that the U.S. and Pakistan had. I think this was 2005. That the Pakistani military realized, one, it would be unpopular to acknowledge drones. The deal was that there was no acknowledgement. But two, they felt like, hey, this is a worthwhile program to keep secret. So we're going to take this one. Fast forward 8 years, the drones had gotten extraordinarily accurate. The intelligence had become much better. There was a fellow from North Waziristan who put it this way to me, that there were these little chips that these kids were throwing in, and they were the informants, that on a number pad there could be a house on 1 through 9, so a house on each number, and the house targeted could be number 5, and they would hit it 10 out of 10 times by the end. Beginning, it was not the case. And even though the precision was there, the Pakistani military, the Pakistani intelligence not only outed the CIA station chief by name, but also essentially encouraged the media, and in some cases paid the media to report there were more civilian casualties than there were. So it's a very complicated story. I think there's a large consensus at this point in the U.S. that there are people who were targeted in the tribal areas who would never have been reached otherwise, because the Pakistanis were either unable or unwilling to do it themselves, many of whom are dead now. But the impact on Pakistan and the level of hatred for the United States was vastly increased by those drones. So that is a real debate that I find interesting, that the drones effectively killed people who the U.S. believed it should kill, but very clearly turned a lot of people against the United States. I would argue, I'm not sure where you're from, but a lot of my Pashtun friends actually would argue that they were more pro-drone, ironically, than a lot of Punjabis and Sindhis. We can get into that later. And so that's the question. Is the goal long-term development, long-term stability, a level of empathy and understanding of Pakistanis, 180 million people, or is the goal to kill a couple dozen Arabs, mostly Arabs, some Pakistani Taliban? Obviously, I argue that there is a long-term need to look at these things. Richard Holbrooke, who's the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, before he died, was arguing this, that we should build U.S. Hospital of Peshawar, U.S. Hospital of Karachi, U.S. Hospital of Lahore, U.S. Hospital of Islamabad. Who cares if they get blown up? Because if we offer something that Pakistanis can see, they will eventually defend that, because it offers free health care, it offers whatever. And what they didn't see is exactly that. What they saw instead are drone strikes. What they saw instead is a policy of working with the head of the military, and that was questioned. What they saw was ripping out of American libraries that used to be across the world and across Pakistan. So, again, there is not a simple answer to your question, but for the people, especially in the State Department, who wanted to create a Pakistan that wouldn't hate America, those people acknowledge today that they failed. Yeah.
We have time for one more. Yeah.
My name is Karen Sukardi, and I also travel quite a bit for work and for personal desire. I just came back from Dubai not long ago, and on the streets, people always ask me about America. I have lived in the United States for over 10 years. And they ask me about why do Americans seem to be so detached from reality about the world? And unfortunately, I just couldn't answer that question without going too deep into how I feel things are happening in the United States. How do you teach compassion in a society that values how much you have and values the entertainment industry so much that I feel is so distant from what makes us brothers and sisters in the basic of community?
If I knew that, I probably wouldn't be a journalist. I think it's a great question, and I don't know. I guess I hope that I do my part. You know, I didn't necessarily get into journalism to speak truth to power. That was never necessarily my motive. My colleagues who did that, I applaud them. I've never been an investigative journalist. I've never been someone to spend months and months on a story trying to find the connections and the data. I got into journalism because I wanted to share stories and I wanted to introduce people, Americans, because my audience is American, to people all around the world. And I do think that can help. I do think that being presented with someone who you believed through stereotype or ignorance was poor or didn't speak English or was a terrorist, and you introduce them to a mother who, from a country that, you know, this American doesn't know much about, who isn't poor, who speaks perfect English, who isn't not only is not a terrorist, but has dreams and desires and has kids who are going to be the same thing that this person who's sitting on the couch in the States watching, hey, they want the same thing for their kids. I hope can do a little bit. You know, I'm not going to do anything about, you know, the Kardashians or whatever the kids are reading these days. You know, I don't think we can do anything about that, but I do believe that, you know, what I hope, what I do, what my colleagues do, what diplomats do, what international NGO workers do, anybody who tries to do this, to share stories, to humanize people, I think that can only help. You know, I don't think it's naive. I don't think it's Sisyphean. I don't think it's impossible, but it's obviously difficult. And again, it is really, really important right now. You know, we have to understand the world. We have to not fear the world. And I don't know. Maybe it's an impossible battle. Maybe we can talk in 40 years, and I'm going to say, man, I wasted the last 40 years. You know, look at what's happening. But I hope not. And I certainly hope to appeal, what I would argue, to a common humanity that we all have.
Nick, thank you so much for joining us here at the Film School.